For the brave airmen of the 8th Air Force, the omnipresent danger of anti-aircraft fire, colloquially known as Flak, became a far greater source of dread than encounters with enemy fighter planes. By the summer of 1943, the formidable German interceptors, though still a threat, could often be repelled through the disciplined cohesion of tight bomber formations and the protective presence of escort fighters. However, the ominous dark explosions of 88mm shells, bursting like malevolent storm clouds, relentlessly pursued the bombers from the moment they entered hostile airspace until they reached their designated targets and beyond. The grim reality of their losses was starkly articulated by the statistical data, which revealed a harrowing truth. Nearly 70% of all B-17 Flying Fortress aircraft that failed to return from missions over Germany were victims of this ferocious anti-aircraft barrage, rather than the agile Messerschmitts or deadly Focke-Wulfs. Indeed, the prevailing sentiment among the crews was a preference for engaging a dozen Luftwaffe fighters in a dogfight over the harrowing experience of navigating a concentrated flak curtain, such as those encountered over heavily defended industrial centers like Schweinfurt or the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley. The sheer lethality of flak extended beyond the prodigious volume of fire hurled skyward. The German military had meticulously transformed anti-aircraft defense into a highly refined scientific discipline. Every significant industrial complex within the Third Reich's territory was encircled by formidable rings of anti-aircraft batteries, bristling with both 88mm and 105mm cannons. Yet, the truly devastating effectiveness of this defense stemmed from the sophisticated methodological framework underpinning these powerful guns. German flak crews did not merely elevate their weapons towards the heavens in a desperate gamble. Instead, they employed advanced predictive technologies capable of precisely calculating the future trajectory of an incoming bomber within a 30-second window, meticulously accounting for its speed, current altitude, and precise direction of flight. Consequently, by the time the bomber reached that exact segment of the sky, the high explosive shells were already detonating, forming an inescapable wall of shrapnel and concussive force. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The established American bomber tactics implemented during 1942 and the initial months of 1943 inadvertently simplified the task for German gunnery teams. The Army Air Forces had adopted a strategic doctrine centered on precision daylight bombing, a methodology that necessitated extended, unswerving, and level bombing runs. The celebrated Norden bomb sight, a marvel of optical mechanical engineering, demanded absolute stability for optimal accuracy. Even the slightest deviation in the critical final minutes preceding the release of bombs would severely compromise the mission's precision. Therefore, B-17 formations would meticulously stabilize their flight path approximately 10 to 15 miles from the target, lock onto an initial geographical reference point, and then proceed with unwavering steadfastness, maintaining a constant altitude and airspeed until the lead bombardier initiated the bomb release. Every subsequent aircraft within the formation would then deploy its ordnance, mirroring the lead bomber's trajectory. Those concluding 3 to 5 minutes of the bomb run stretched into an eternity for the crews. Initially, small dark puffs of flak would materialize ahead, appearing almost innocuous from a distance. However, as the formation pressed onward, it would invariably plunge into this deadly canopy, and the aircraft would begin to judder violently from the concussions of near misses. Shrapnel propelled with terrifying velocity would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the bombers, producing sounds akin to a furious hailstorm pelting a tin roof. Yet these hailstones possessed the lethal capacity to sever vital hydraulic lines, tragically incapacitate a waist gunner, or, in the worst instances, ignite a volatile fuel tank. The acrid scent of cordite, the propellant used in the shells, would permeate the flight deck, infiltrating through countless small perforations in the fuselage. Despite this escalating terror, deviation was not an option. The crews were compelled to maintain their formation integrity, hold their assigned altitude, and steadfastly maintain their heading, all while German predictive systems calculated their impending demise with chilling mechanical exactitude. The inherent predictability of these American bombing runs proved to be a fatal vulnerability. Every bombardier required identical operational parameters, a stable platform, an unobstructed visual target, and the absence of any evasive maneuvers. Every pilot adhered to an identical flight profile, precisely as mandated by their training manuals. The Germans were acutely aware of this operational rigidity. Their expert flak officers had diligently studied American tactics, meticulously timing the bomb runs and precisely measuring the approach patterns. They understood that once a B-17 formation committed to its bombing run, it would steadfastly maintain a consistent course, typically at an altitude of approximately 25,000 feet, with only minor variations, and at an airspeed of around 180 bix per hour. This foreknowledge enabled their predictive systems to be preset, anticipating the bombers' exact positions. By the spring of 1943, bomber crews were engaged in a grim calculus of probabilities. Fighter attacks, while undeniably terrifying, were typically fleeting encounters. A Focke-Wulf 190, for example, would execute its attack pass and disengage within mere seconds. Flak, in contrast, was an impersonal yet relentlessly persistent threat. It shadowed the bombers throughout the entire target area, an impenetrable curtain of steel and fire that they were compelled to penetrate to fulfill their mission. Some crews recounted flying through barrages of such intense concentration that the explosions seemed to merge into a continuous, rolling wall of dense black smoke, punctuated by vivid red-orange flashes. A terrifying spectacle that formations simply had to endure. Veteran airmen would soberly advise new recruits not to dwell on the danger. The instruction was simple: strap in, point the aircraft's nose towards the target, and fervently hope that one's individual fate was not inscribed upon one of those exploding shells. The established doctrine appeared immutable. Precision bombing inherently demanded precision flying, but men were consistently perishing along those predictable, straight flight paths, leading some pilots to quietly question if an alternative approach might exist. The crucial instrument that endowed German flak with such devastating lethality was housed within robust concrete bunkers adjacent to every gun battery, the Kommando-Gerät 40. This mechanical computing device possessed an almost uncanny ability to predict a bomber's future position with astonishing accuracy. This was not a matter of mere guesswork or the seasoned observations of experienced gunners scanning the sky. This was mathematics rendered tangible a complex arrangement of gears and cams performing ballistic calculations with a speed far surpassing any human crew's capability. This intricate system represented the zenith of fire control technology of its era, and American bomber crews were tragically paying the ultimate price for its unparalleled precision. The intricate process commenced with optical rangefinders strategically positioned around each flak battery. These sophisticated stereoscopic instruments, some boasting base lengths nearing 5 meters, were capable of determining the precise distance to a target aircraft at altitudes up to 40,000 feet. Highly trained operators would meticulously track an incoming bomber formation through their optical sights, continuously feeding real-time range data to the commando garret via electrical signals. Concurrently, other operators would measure the target's azimuth, horizontal angle, and elevation angle, vertical angle. Thus, 3 critical streams of data, range, bearing, and altitude, flowed into the predictor every few seconds, painting a comprehensive picture of the bomber's movement. Within the commando garret, a labyrinthine network of mechanical calculators sprang into action. The device did not merely register the bomber's current location at that precise moment. Instead, its primary function was to calculate the exact position the bomber would occupy by the time the fired shell reached its target. An 88mm round, launched from an altitude of 25,000 feet, typically required approximately 30 seconds to ascend to its intended target altitude. During this critical 30-second interval, a B-17 flying at 100 miles would traverse a distance of roughly 1.5 miles. The commando garret diligently factored in this forward movement, along with other crucial variables such as wind drift, air density, ambient temperature, and the specific ballistic characteristics of the ammunition being deployed. Cams and gears meticulously meshed together, executing complex calculus through an ingenious system of mechanical analog computation. The computed output from the predictor was then directly transmitted to the gun layers. Dials on each individual 88mm gun received continuous positional updates, the precise elevation angle, the traverse bearing, and, most critically, the fuse setting. German time fuses in 1943 could be set with remarkable exactitude, down to tenths of a second. The commando garret calculated the precise moment each shell needed to detonate to strategically place its fragmentation pattern directly into the bomber's predicted future position. Loaders would then meticulously adjust the fuse rings on the shells according to the predictor's solution, and the gun would fire. If the bomber maintained its course and speed as predicted, the mathematical solution was, from the German perspective, flawlessly perfect. The exactitude of mathematics was flawlessly applied to the deadly art of aerial defense. A proficient German flak battery possessed the formidable capability to launch 6 shells per gun into the atmosphere every minute. A typical heavy flak battery comprised between 6 and 8 such formidable weapons, all seamlessly integrated and controlled by a single commando garret. This sophisticated arrangement translated into a relentless volley of 40 to 50 shells each minute, every one meticulously calibrated to detonate at a precisely determined point in space. The advanced predictor system would incessantly refine its calculations as fresh tracking data streamed in, effectively guiding the explosive barrage along the bomber's projected trajectory. The culminating effect was the creation of a lethal volumetric box of airspace, saturated with lethal steel fragments, meticulously timed to materialize at the identical coordinates occupied by the approaching bomber formation. This intricate defensive apparatus, however, hinged upon one fundamental prerequisite: the absolute necessity of predictable target behavior. The Commando Duret's complex algorithms inherently presumed that the target aircraft would steadfastly maintain its current velocity vector, including its heading, speed, and altitude. Should a bomber abruptly alter its altitude or vary its airspeed, the predictor's meticulously crafted solution would instantaneously become invalid and useless. Yet, German intelligence possessed an intimate understanding of American aerial doctrine. They had assiduously acquired captured training manuals, exhaustively interrogated captured prisoners of war, and diligently observed hundreds of bombing missions. Through this comprehensive intelligence gathering, they had ascertained that once a B-17 formation settled into its bomb run, it would steadfastly adhere to constant flight parameters for a critical window of 3 to 5 minutes. The Commando Duret was therefore ingeniously engineered specifically to capitalize on and exploit this anticipated predictability. By the middle of 1943, the devastating efficacy of these automated defenses was not merely anecdotal but statistically quantifiable, particularly over heavily fortified targets, such as the Hanseatic cities of Bremen and Hamburg, and the vital industrial heartlands of the Ruhr region. German flak batteries were consistently achieving hit rates that would have been utterly unattainable through conventional, manually aimed gun-laying methods. Detailed post-mission damage assessments of bombers returning to their bases in England unequivocally demonstrated that the vast majority of these aircraft bore the scars of flak damage, and critically, the shells were consistently observed bursting at precisely the intended altitudes. The destructive fragments were not haphazard. They were arriving exactly where the sophisticated predictors had calculated they should be. The mechanical brains of the Commando Duret were undeniably triumphing in this mathematical duel, and American bomber crews found themselves without a viable countermeasure. They were, by adherence to their established doctrine, flying directly into an inescapable computational trap, and the prospect of altering that doctrine appeared insurmountable. The revered Norden bomb sight, an instrument of unparalleled precision, demanded absolute stability for its optimal operation. And ironically, it was precisely this stability that the Commando Duret required to inflict maximum casualties. Clearly, a critical shift was inevitable. But in the balmy summer of 1943, the exact nature of this necessary change remained an elusive mystery. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video for more insights. We would be incredibly grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from and what you think about this compelling topic. August 17, 1943, would forever be etched into the annals of aerial warfare as the pivotal day that cast the entire strategic bombing campaign into profound doubt. The audacious double strike against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, two strategically vital centers for ball-bearing and aircraft production respectively, represented the deepest penetration into German airspace that the 8th Air Force had ever dared to attempt. While the mission planners had indeed anticipated significant losses, the grim reality of what transpired over those heavily defended targets dramatically exceeded every dire projection. Of the 376 B-17 flying fortresses that had valiantly departed English airfields that fateful morning, an astonishing 60 aircraft tragically failed to return. An additional 168 bombers limped back to base, so severely damaged that many would never be deemed airworthy again. The resulting casualty rate soared to an unsustainable 20%, a figure far beyond the acceptable threshold for any protracted military operation. The intensity of the flak encountered over Schweinfurt was utterly unprecedented, unlike anything the veteran bomber crews had ever experienced. Gunners aboard the American aircraft reported a barrage concentration of such phenomenal density that the individual explosions seemed to coalesce into a single, continuous, oppressive black cloud. One particularly harrowing account from a pilot of the 381st Bomb Group vividly described flying directly into a seemingly impenetrable wall of smoke where distinct bursts were indistinguishable, merely a churning, chaotic mass of shrapnel and concussive blast waves that violently tossed his heavy bomber around as if it were a mere leaf caught in a tempest. This predictor-directed fire was devastatingly precise. Shells were observed detonating at precisely 23,000 to 26,000 feet, the exact altitude band where the concentrated bomber stream was most vulnerable. Crucially, the staggering losses were not distributed randomly across the formations. Aircraft meticulously adhering to the standard bombing profile, flying straight, maintaining a level attitude, and holding constant altitude and airspeed, invariably sustained the most severe punishment. Lead bombardiers in each individual group, who were compelled to maintain the steadiest and most unswerving course for the longest duration to ensure bombing accuracy, suffered a disproportionate number of casualties. The Germans had shrewdly learned to concentrate their fire on these formation leaders, understanding that effectively disrupting the lead aircraft would inevitably scatter the entire group's bomb pattern, thereby compromising the mission's objective. The commando-garret predictors were thus being employed with a sophisticated layer of tactical intelligence, transcending mere mechanical precision. Back at Bomber Command headquarters in High Wycombe, the stark statistics from these missions landed with the force of a bombshell, creating their own profound shockwaves. General Frederick Anderson and his dedicated staff had always acknowledged that daylight precision bombing operations would inherently be costly. However, these new, alarming numbers suggested that the entire strategic approach might be fundamentally unsustainable. Simple mathematical projections painted a grim picture. If every deep penetration mission incurred a 20% loss rate, a crew's probability of surviving a full 25-mission tour plummeted to virtually zero. The critical replacement pipeline could not possibly keep pace with such a voracious rate of attrition. Training facilities across the United States were already operating at their absolute maximum capacity. Yet they were utterly incapable of producing replacement crews swiftly enough to offset this catastrophic rate of loss. The second Schweinfurt raid, launched on October 14, 1943, definitively confirmed the burgeoning crisis. This infamous mission, which became grimly known as Black Thursday, resulted in the loss of another 60 bombers, with an additional 17 aircraft so severely damaged that they were regrettably written off as irreparable. The 8th Air Force had dispatched 291 B-17s against the target, and by nightfall, a staggering 77 were simply gone, representing an appalling 26% loss rate. While the crucial ball-bearing plants were indeed struck, the strategic achievement came at an unacceptably heavy and catastrophic price. In the immediate aftermath of Black Thursday, deep penetration missions were summarily and temporarily suspended. The ambitious bomber offensive, which had been painstakingly designed to soften German industrial and military infrastructure and pave the way for the impending D-Day invasion, had been brought to a complete and abrupt halt by the formidable German air defenses. Intelligence officers immediately commenced conducting exhaustive and detailed debriefings, meticulously searching for any discernible pattern that might explain why some aircraft miraculously survived while others tragically did not. They scrupulously examined flak damage on returning bombers, carefully noting the precise locations where shells had exploded relative to the aircraft's position. They also interviewed countless pilots and bombardiers, pressing them for details about the exact moments when they had observed the heaviest concentrations of enemy fire. Gradually, a critical pattern began to emerge from this wealth of data, although it initially struck many as counterintuitive. Some returning crews reported that flak bursts appeared to be anticipating their position, detonating slightly ahead of where their aircraft were currently flying, as if the German gunners possessed an uncanny foreknowledge of their future location. This was, of course, precisely what was occurring. The commando Jarrett was, by design, engineered to project shells into the bomber's future position, not its current one. However, this recurring observation ignited a fundamental and crucial question in the minds of the operational planners. What if the bomber intentionally deviated from that predicted future position? What if the commando Jarrett's core assumptions about predictable target behavior were deliberately and effectively violated? The established military doctrine unequivocally stipulated that no deviation from a stable flight path was permissible during the critical bomb run. This directive was explicitly articulated within all training manuals and instructional materials, underscoring the foundational belief that the entire theoretical framework of precision daylight bombing operations was predicated upon maintaining absolute aerial stability. However, this steadfast adherence to stability was exacting a devastating human cost, prompting a growing number of officers to critically question the true value of achieving pinpoint accuracy if the air crews themselves perished before witnessing the successful impact of their ordnance. The profound operational challenges and significant casualties encountered during the pivotal months of August and October 1943 had, in essence, created a substantial fissure in the long-accepted conventional wisdom, thereby opening a crucial pathway through which adaptive and innovative strategies would eventually emerge. The initial departures from this rigid doctrine did not originate within the strategic planning rooms of command headquarters, but rather in the cramped confines of bomber cockpits high above enemy territory in Germany. Highly experienced aviators, those who had successfully completed a substantial number of combat sorties, often accumulating 15 or 20 missions, began to place greater trust in their honed instincts and battle-tested judgment than in the unyielding directives of their official training manuals. A notable pioneer in this regard was Captain Robert Morgan of the 91st Bomb Group, an individual who would later achieve widespread recognition for successfully completing an entire combat tour at the controls of the iconic B-17 Memphis Belle. In the closing months of 1943, Captain Morgan initiated tentative explorations into minor altitude adjustments during his aircraft's terminal approach to various targets. His actions were not an act of outright defiance, Instead, they represented a nuanced interpretation of existing orders, demonstrating a degree of operational flexibility. Crucially, his bombardier was still able to acquire satisfactory sight pictures for accurate bomb release, even when the bomber ascended or descended by a few hundred feet during the critical bombing run. Concurrently, other air crews observed an intriguing anomaly when they implemented similar, albeit unauthorized, modifications to their flight paths. Lieutenant James McLaughlin, piloting a B-17 named Lucky Strike, recounted a particularly remarkable incident that transpired over Bremen in November 1943. This event subsequently became a pervasive topic of conversation and debate among air crews for several weeks following its occurrence. His bomber formation had just stabilized its trajectory for the bombing run at a precise altitude of 24,000 feet when they encountered a barrage of exceptionally intense anti-aircraft fire, which began to tightly bracket their position. In a spontaneous reaction, McLaughlin instinctively maneuvered the aircraft by pulling back on the control yoke, thereby achieving an ascent of approximately 400 feet over the subsequent 60 seconds. Astonishingly, the anti-aircraft shell detonations that had previously been alarmingly proximate to his aircraft now consistently appeared below its new position, despite ascending into what was theoretically an area of potentially greater flak density. The projectiles were exploding precisely where his bomber had been moments before, rather than at its current location. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Comprehending the underlying rationale for this phenomenon proved challenging initially, primarily because the observed outcome appeared counterintuitive to conventional aerial combat wisdom. The ingrained reflex of virtually every pilot dictated that the appropriate response to incoming flak was to execute a dive, rapidly decreasing altitude to escape beneath the explosive bursts and leverage gravity to accelerate away from the immediate threat zone. Yet, in McLaughlin's case, a deliberate ascent had been performed, and the anti-aircraft fire had conspicuously failed to connect. News of this peculiar event quickly disseminated throughout the 91st Bomb Group and adjacent operational units. A segment of the pilot community initially dismissed the incident as a mere stroke of good fortune, positing that the German anti-aircraft crews might have coincidentally recalibrated their targeting at that precise moment. Nevertheless, other aviators were prompted to initiate their own experimental maneuvers, systematically introducing minor altitude deviations during their bombing runs and meticulously observing the spatial relationship of the flak bursts relative to their modified flight paths. Captain Charles Cruikshank, a prominent figure within the 303rd Bomb Group, undertook what essentially constituted rigorous field testing during his combat missions throughout December 1943. Prior to each sortie, he would meticulously brief his crew, informing them of his intention to potentially diverge from the prescribed standard altitude during the critical bomb run. He specifically instructed his bombardier to provide precise feedback regarding any perceived impact on bombing accuracy. Across 3 successive missions targeting objectives in northwestern Germany, Cruikshank deliberately initiated gradual ascents ranging from 500 to 800 feet, commencing approximately 2 minutes before the designated bomb release point. His bombardier subsequently confirmed that the sophisticated Norden bomb sight possessed the capability to effectively compensate for a consistent rate of climb. provided that the ascent remained stable. Of even greater significance was the consistent observation that the anti-aircraft fire, specifically calibrated for their original expected altitude, invariably detonated beneath their aircraft's new position. The underlying physical principles behind this evasive technique became clear and logical once pilots engaged in thorough analytical consideration. It was understood that the formidable 88mm anti-aircraft shells required approximately 30 seconds to ascend to their target altitude. Therefore, if a German predictor system, such as the Kommandogerät, computed that an aircraft would be at 24,000 feet in 30 seconds, but the aircraft was actively ascending at a rate of 100 feet per minute, it would, in fact, be at 24,500 feet by the time the shells reached their pre-programmed detonation altitude. This inherent time lag in projectile flight consequently generated a critical temporal gap which strategic altitude modifications could effectively exploit. While the Kommandogerät was renowned for its exceptional precision, its calculations were fundamentally predicated upon the aircraft's observed behavior at the moment of calculation. A deliberate alteration of that behavior would, therefore, render the predictive firing solution entirely obsolete. The innovative concept did not gain immediate universal acceptance. Operations officers voiced substantial apprehension regarding the potential compromise of formation integrity. They argued that if individual pilots were permitted to arbitrarily alter their altitudes, the meticulously maintained tight defensive formations, crucial for mutual protection, would inevitably disintegrate. Group commanders also expressed significant concern that bombing accuracy would suffer considerably if bombardiers were compelled to operate from inherently unstable aircraft platforms. Furthermore, a segment of senior staff officers regarded the entire proposition as verging on insubordination, viewing pilots' creativity as a direct defiance of established operational procedures. They firmly asserted that existing doctrine had been meticulously crafted by highly qualified experts, rigorously evaluated at specialized bombardier training institutions, and subsequently validated through extensive combat experience. To their minds, one simply did not discard such foundational doctrine based on the unproven theories of a few individual pilots. Nevertheless, the pilots who adopted these new tactics continued to return from missions, a stark contrast to the fate of many others. By January 1944, the volume of mission reports detailing intentional altitude variations and correlative flak patterns had grown to such an extent that intelligence officers found it impossible to disregard the emerging association. It became increasingly apparent that air crews adhering to stringent altitude discipline appeared to sustain a greater number of hits from anti-aircraft fire compared to those who proactively introduced altitude changes. While this observation did not constitute irrefutable scientific proof, it was undeniably highly suggestive. The available data, though anecdotal and dispersed across numerous mission debriefings and individual crew testimonies, consistently pointed towards a compelling trend. A clear pattern was crystallizing. The very rigid, straight and level flight profile mandated by official doctrine might, in fact, be precisely the predictable behavior that German anti-aircraft predictors required to effectively target and destroy Allied bombers. This innovation, born directly from the primal instinct for survival, was now beginning to fundamentally challenge established textbook procedures, and the accumulating body of evidence was becoming progressively more difficult to refute or ignore. The revolutionary tactical maneuver, destined to preserve countless lives, acquired a name that paradoxically alluded to the very danger it sought to circumvent: climbing into the flak. By the nascent months of 1944, a sufficient number of air crews had experimented with these altitude modifications, allowing the precise operational mechanics of the technique to become clearly defined and understood. This was not merely a series of haphazard evasive actions or desperate uncoordinated ascents. Rather, it represented a meticulously calculated exploitation of the inherent temporal discrepancy between the moment German anti-aircraft predictors generated their firing solutions and the subsequent interval required for those calculations to manifest as exploding shells at the bomber's altitude. The most effective rendition of this technique entailed a consistent and controlled ascent of between 500 and 1,000 feet during the final approach phase, commencing approximately 3 minutes prior to the designated bomb release point. The precise timing of this maneuver was paramount to its success. Initiating the climb too prematurely would allow German tracking stations ample opportunity to input the newly observed flight data into their commando Jurate systems, which would then simply recalculate and generate updated firing solutions for the bomber's altered trajectory. Conversely, commencing the ascent too late would deny the bombardier sufficient time to acquire and maintain a stable sight picture, thereby compromising the accuracy of the bomb release. The empirically determined sweet spot for initiating this climb appeared to fall within the window of approximately 2.5 to 3 minutes before bombs away. At this specific juncture, German predictors would have already finalized their firing solutions and begun transmitting the corresponding fuse settings to the anti-aircraft batteries. The personnel loading the guns would be in the process of setting the time rings on the shells based on calculations that erroneously assumed the bomber would remain at its initial altitude. Crucially, these shells would already be in the process of being loaded into the breeches, making real-time adjustments impossible. The precise management of an aircraft's ascent velocity proved to be as critically important as the exact timing of the maneuver itself. Should a pilot initiate an overly aggressive climb, the structural integrity of the formation risked being compromised, simultaneously presenting the bombardier with an unstable platform, thus hindering accurate targeting. Conversely, a climb executed too gently would fail to provide the necessary elevation to effectively evade the predetermined burst zone of enemy anti-aircraft fire. Seasoned aviators ultimately discerned that a steady ascent ranging from 80 to 120 feet per minute yielded the most favorable outcomes. For instance, maintaining a climb rate of 100 feet per minute for the 3 minutes preceding bomb release would result in an altitude gain of 300 feet. This elevation proved sufficient to position the aircraft safely above the predicted detonation points of the enemy's shells, yet remained gentle enough to allow bombardiers to meticulously maintain their sight pictures and refine their complex calculations without undue disruption. Lieutenant William Cassidy, a member of the 384th Bomb Group, meticulously documented in his personal diary the inaugural instance his crew deliberately engaged in an upward trajectory amidst anti-aircraft fire over Frankfurt in February 1944. As their bomber steadied onto the designated bomb run at an altitude of 23,500 feet, the initial bursts of flak materialized ominously ahead. Diverging from established operational doctrine, Cassidy commenced a measured, gradual ascent. His co-pilot, understandably apprehensive, questioned this audacious decision. They were, after all, climbing directly into the menacing black clouds of explosions. Yet Cassidy steadfastly maintained his climb rate at approximately 90 feet per minute. Soon, the anti-aircraft fire that had previously been detonating at their initial altitude began to appear conspicuously below them. The formation released its payload from a new elevation of 24,200 feet, and remarkably, sustained no losses during the engagement over the target area. Every single aircraft successfully returned to base. This tactical triumph was rooted in a fundamental vulnerability inherent within the sophisticated German fire control system. While the Commando Jarrett possessed the capability to compute exceptionally brilliant firing solutions, it crucially lacked the ability to instantaneously recalculate these solutions. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Once the initial tracking data was meticulously fed into the predictor system and a preliminary firing solution was ingeniously generated, a discernible delay, typically spanning 20 to 30 seconds, transpired before updated data could be processed into a revised solution. During this critical interval, shells equipped with preset fuses were already loaded into the ordnance and swiftly discharged. These projectiles were irrevocably committed to detonating at a specific altitude, an elevation exclusively derived from the now outdated tracking information. Consequently, if the target aircraft had altered its altitude during this precise processing and firing cycle, the incoming shells would harmlessly detonate in empty airspace, posing no threat whatsoever to the maneuvering bomber. Furthermore, the inherent time-of-flight delay of the projectiles itself conferred an additional layer of protective advantage. An 82 mm shell, launched from ground level toward a target positioned at 25,000 feet, typically experienced a flight duration ranging from approximately 28 to 32 seconds, with minor variations influenced by prevailing atmospheric conditions. Within this crucial 30-second window, a B-17 bomber executing a climb at 100 feet per minute would effectively gain an additional 500 feet in altitude. Therefore, while the enemy shell would indeed arrive at the specific elevation where the predictor system had calculated the bomber would be, the aircraft itself would, in reality, be a full 500 feet higher. The resultant fragmentation pattern emanating from the shell's burst would typically disperse in a conical shape below the aircraft, with the majority of lethal fragments traveling horizontally or downwards from the point of detonation. By actively climbing, the bomber effectively positioned itself above this critical kill zone, minimizing exposure to deadly shrapnel. Aircrews quickly began to articulate their observations of this novel anti-aircraft phenomenon in vivid, easily comprehensible visual terms, which served to clarify the underlying concept. They would recount witnessing shells detonating at what visually appeared to be their current altitude, yet understanding that these explosions were, in fact, occurring precisely where their aircraft had been just moments before. One particularly insightful navigator described the experience as akin to observing footsteps relentlessly chasing one up a staircase. Each explosion served as a marker of the position just vacated. Yet the aircraft consistently remained one step ahead, perpetually evading the imminent danger. The psychological ramifications of this innovative tactic were undeniably profound. Instead of passively and helplessly enduring a relentless barrage of enemy fire, pilots now experienced a powerful sense of agency, feeling that they were actively outmaneuvering and defeating the sophisticated German fire control system. They perceived themselves as ingeniously turning the predictor's inherent precision against itself. The Commando Garret, despite its continued perfect calculations, was, in essence, computing solutions for an aircraft that, at those specific coordinates, no longer physically existed. By March 1944, the altitude change tactic had successfully transitioned from isolated individual experimentation to an officially sanctioned group-level operational doctrine. Colonel Curtis LeMay, then commanding the 3rd Bomb Division, stood among the pioneering senior officers to formally endorse and authorize this innovative technique. Having meticulously reviewed mission reports and comprehensive loss statistics, LeMay had meticulously cultivated his reputation through a consistent record of tactical innovation. He was credited with developing the highly effective combat box formation, which endowed B-17s with mutually overlapping defensive fire capabilities, and he possessed an acute ability to recognize genuinely effective field innovations when they emerged. His operations order, issued on March 12, 1944, explicitly granted group leaders the necessary discretion to employ altitude variations during their bomb runs, accompanied by specific, detailed guidance regarding optimal timing and climb rates. Nevertheless, the implementation of this novel strategy was not entirely devoid of initial resistance. Operations officers, adhering strictly to established protocols, contended that any deviation from stable, level flight inherently compromised the very precision that served as the primary justification for conducting daylight bombing missions in the first place. Their argument posited that if American bombers were to accept the inevitably heavy losses associated with daylight operations, as opposed to adopting the Royal Air Force's night bombing approach, then those sacrifices absolutely had to yield demonstrably superior bombing accuracy. Major Harold Bowman, stationed at White Bomber Command Headquarters, submitted a formal memo in early April, expressing serious reservations about whether altitude changes would degrade the circular error probable, CP, which defines the radius within which bombs are expected to fall, to unacceptably high levels. The memo earnestly requested a temporary cessation of the tactic until rigorous, proper testing could be conducted at dedicated bombardier training facilities located within the United States. Yet, the frontline combat crews had, through the irrefutable evidence of practical results, already definitively settled that particular debate. Bombardiers consistently reported that as long as the climb rate remained absolutely steady and did not exceed 120 feet per minute, the Nordensight's advanced gyroscopic stabilization and intricate rate mechanisms were fully capable of compensating for the vertical movement. The bombardier's task simply involved adjusting his rate knobs to effectively account for the ongoing climb, treating it as another variable in his calculations, much like wind drift or airspeed. Lieutenant Thomas Farabee, who would subsequently achieve widespread renown as the bombardier aboard the Enola Gay, successfully flew multiple missions with the 384th Bomb Group, employing these climb techniques, and consistently placed his bomb patterns well within the acceptable parameters of the target's mean point of impact. Consequently, training protocols were swiftly adapted to incorporate this proven tactic. New aircrews arriving in England during the spring of 1944 received comprehensive briefings that formally included the altitude change technique as an integral component of standard target approach procedures. The guidance provided was notably specific. Crews were instructed to initiate a steady climb 150 seconds prior to the anticipated bombs away moment. They were to maintain a consistent climb rate ranging between 80 and 110 feet per minute, holding that rate constant to ensure the bombardier had a predictable and stable platform for aiming. Furthermore, lead bombardiers, who held the crucial responsibility for orchestrating when entire formations would release their bombs, were granted additional latitude to adjust the precise initiation timing of the climb based on their real-time observations of enemy flak patterns and German tracking behavior. The evolution in tracking behavior across the 8th Air Force emerged not from top-down directives, but rather spread organically and spontaneously throughout the very fabric of the bomber stream itself. Air crews, flying in formation, would meticulously observe neighboring groups employing novel climb techniques and, crucially, note a significant reduction in the anti-aircraft artillery damage they sustained during post-mission debriefings. Back at their respective airfields, pilots and navigators would convene, exchanging insights and comparing notes about which innovative maneuvers proved efficacious and which did not. The harrowing experience of the 91st Bomb Group over Brunswick on April 8, 1944, quickly became an extensively debated and widely circulated example of this tactical shift. On that fateful day, the 91st Bomb Group commenced a deliberate ascent from an altitude of 24,000 feet to 25,200 feet during their critical bomb run, while adjacent groups steadfastly maintained their original altitude. The climbing group, remarkably, incurred damage to only 4 aircraft from Flak, none of which were critically impaired. In stark contrast, the groups that held their altitude forfeited 3 bombers and had 11 additional aircraft critically damaged. Word of such stark disparities in survival rates propagated more swiftly and convincingly through the airmen's grapevine than any formal directive or administrative communication could possibly travel. Certain groups, driven by a spirit of innovation and a desperate need for survival, developed further modifications on this fundamental method. Time 2s. The 3,005th Bomb Group, for instance, trial-tested a complex climbing turn, integrating a significant height acquisition with a subtle directional alteration during the final minute before the release of ordnance. This sophisticated maneuver introduced a lateral shift to the already challenging vertical movement, thereby further disrupting the German predictor calculations. Other squadrons explored incremental ascents, a method where aircraft would maintain level flight for approximately 30 seconds, then ascend rapidly by 200 feet, only to hold altitude again. However, the prevailing agreement that ultimately emerged among the aircrews strongly preferred the steady, continuous climb as the supremely efficacious technique. The incremental ascents, while innovative, inadvertently provided German tracking crews with recognizable sequences that could be fed into their targeting computers, allowing for some degree of prediction. Conversely, the steady, uninterrupted climb presented a constantly fluctuating stream of information, which proved significantly more challenging for the German fire control systems to process into precise firing coordinates. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. By May 1944, as readiness efforts escalated dramatically in anticipation of the monumental Normandy invasion, this altitude change technique had transitioned from an experimental maneuver into an established protocol across the majority of the 8th Air Force's bomb groups. Operational directives and mission planning documents now formally incorporated specific climb initiation points and target climb altitudes, delineating them with the same precision previously reserved for initial points and bomb release lines. Novice aviators, freshly arrived from the United States, were thoroughly instructed in this technique during their initial orientation sorties, even before embarking on their very first combat mission. What had initially begun as an unsanctioned departure from established principles had, through practical application and undeniable success, become official policy itself. The entire bomber force had undergone a profound strategic development, adapting ingeniously to persist against a sophisticated fire control system that, merely months prior, had been annihilating formations with devastating efficiency. This profound change did not originate from senior command's grand design or high-level strategic planning, but rather from the collective wisdom and gathered insights of the airmen themselves, who devised a method to outwit the intricate mathematical computations that threatened their very existence. The German forces, naturally, were well aware of the unfolding aerial dynamics above their territory. By the summer of 1944, anti-aircraft unit leaders were communicating to their command that American bomber squadrons had ceased to exhibit foreseeable flight characteristics during their attack approaches. Luftwaffe intelligence personnel, through the interrogation of detained B-17 aviators, discovered the specifics of these altitude change tactics that had become conventional practice. The critical query then became whether German fire control systems possessed the capability to adjust with sufficient speed to neutralize this significant development in American aerial strategy. The Commando Jarrat predictor crews, responsible for operating these sophisticated targeting devices, endeavored various retaliatory measures. The most apparent remedy involved accelerating the rate of positional data input. Instead of supplying spatial information to the predictor every 8 to 10 seconds, operators sought to refresh data every 4 to 5 seconds. The underlying hypothesis held considerable merit. A more rapid information flow would theoretically allow the mechanical computer to identify shifts in elevation more promptly and readjust targeting coordinates before ordnance was discharged. However, in actual application, the human element proved incapable of sustaining such a tempo consistently. The arduous task of monitoring an aircraft at an elevation of 25,000 feet through optical rangefinders, while vocalizing exact readings every few seconds, inevitably resulted in exhaustion and inaccuracies. Consequently, the fidelity of information diminished significantly whenever personnel hastened their tasks. German engineers also investigated alterations to the Commando Jarrat itself. Some batteries were equipped with improved computational devices featuring supplementary processing components engineered specifically to ascertain ascent velocity and integrated into targeting computations. These modernized units, identified as Commando Jarrat 4041, began appearing at vital defensive positions around Berlin and the Ruhr Valley in mid-1944. While these improvements offered only slight assistance, they were ultimately unable to surmount the inherent temporal delay issue. Despite more refined computations, shells still needed a full 30 seconds to attain their intended elevation, and bombers continued to ascend an additional 500 feet within that critical period. Although the predictor could project the velocity of ascent, if the bomber modified its speed of ascent or ceased its upward trajectory, the prediction proved erroneous, rendering the shell's trajectory inaccurate. A further proposed remedy involved calibrating detonation mechanisms to create a more extended vertical explosion profile. Conventional methodology previously dictated configuring fuses for exact elevation explosions, which created a lateral scattering of shrapnel. German fuse technicians, therefore, trial-tested varied fuse configurations. Some shells were set to explode at the anticipated altitude, others were set to detonate 200 feet higher, and still others 400 feet higher. This ingenious arrangement created a tiered sequence of detonations, a vertical ladder of explosions designed to encompass a climbing bomber. The 88mm batteries defending the Merseburg refineries utilized this method widely during missions in September 1944. While this approach augmented the sheer quantity of metallic fragments aloft, it paradoxically reduced the concentration at particular elevations, thereby diminishing the likelihood of striking individual aerial targets. The supremely impactful German retaliatory measure stemmed not from technological advancement, but from operational modification, the premature initiation of combat, or earlier engagement. Anti-aircraft batteries began commencing bombardment from extended distances, intercepting aerial squadrons 8 to 10 miles from the target, rather than delaying until they were within 5 miles. This strategic shift compelled U.S. aviators to initiate their defensive ascents sooner in their approach, which in turn afforded German targeting personnel an extended period for observation of the altitude change and the opportunity to input current information into their computational devices. Some batteries realized enhanced precision with this method, particularly around fortified objectives, such as the synthetic oil plants at Luna. However, extended interception distances implied that ordnance traversed a greater expanse of air, consequently diminishing both their precision and destructive capability, even with impeccably calibrated detonation mechanisms. German strategic principles also gravitated toward concentrated bombardments across anticipated areas rather than the exact targeting of singular aerial vehicles. This represented a conceptual departure, a philosophical retreat from the advanced targeting mechanisms that had rendered the Kommandozierat exceptionally lethal. Instead of computing exact interception points, gun emplacements would deluge vast expanses of the sky with shells configured for diverse elevations and detonation settings. This methodology was colloquially termed Flak carpets by the aviators, dense arrays of explosions that a squadron was compelled to traverse irrespective of alterations in elevation. This approach, however, expended vast amounts of ordnance and demanded greater aggregations of artillery, assets that the worsening state of Germany's manufacturing capabilities rendered progressively arduous to supply. The autumn of 1944 witnessed a notable decrease in the efficacy of German anti-aircraft artillery, even in the face of augmented gun emplacements safeguarding vital objectives. Comprehensive statistical evaluations conducted by the 8th Air Force Intelligence Branch revealed a significant reduction in bomber attrition rates due to flak, moving from the devastating proportions observed in late 1943 to more manageable thresholds. For instance, bombing sorties that previously resulted in the loss of approximately 20 aircraft during 1943 now typically incurred losses of merely 8 to 10 planes. While the strategic adjustment of altitude was undeniably a key element, other contributing factors included enhanced fighter protection, more cohesive flight configurations, and a noticeable deterioration in the proficiency of German anti-aircraft crews. Nevertheless, it was unequivocally apparent that this particular tactical innovation had substantially blunted the precision of the enemy's predictor-based targeting systems. The sophisticated Kommando-Gerat anti-aircraft director continued to pose a considerable threat until the cessation of hostilities, especially in instances where American aerial squadrons committed navigational errors or when mechanical malfunctions compelled bombers to adhere to foreseeable flight trajectories. However, this formidable apparatus never recaptured the absolute mathematical precision and lethal certainty it had demonstrated with such devastating effect in 1943. Crucially, this technological superiority was not overcome by a countervailing advancement in American engineering, but rather by ingenious tactical modifications. The Allied bomber forces did not vanquish the predictor system through superior technological design or innovation. Instead, they rendered it less effective by deliberately deviating from the predictable behavioral patterns that the system's creators had inherently assumed. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The tangible benefits of ascending into the zone of anti-aircraft fire became empirically measurable once a sufficient volume of mission-specific intelligence had been amassed for rigorous analytical scrutiny. Extensive post-war investigations, meticulously undertaken by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, meticulously scrutinized the rates of aircraft attrition, both prior to and following the comprehensive implementation of altitude modification strategies. The resultant statistical evidence painted an unequivocal picture. Aerial bombing campaigns executed during the initial 6 months of 1944, which incorporated these innovative climb maneuvers, consistently registered a reduction in flak-induced losses ranging from approximately 15 to 30% when juxtaposed against comparable operations targeting similar objectives in the latter half of 1943. While the precise degree of improvement exhibited variability based on the intensity of enemy defenses and the exactitude with which formations executed these ascents, the overarching statistical trajectory was undeniably conclusive. More detailed and specific corroboration emerged from the individual operational logs of various bomb groups. For instance, the renowned 100th Bomb Group, which had tragically acquired the ominous moniker Bloody Hundredth, owing to its catastrophic losses throughout 1943, experienced a profound amelioration in its casualty figures subsequent to the formal adoption of ascent protocols in March 1944. During the 5-month span from March to August 1944, this particular unit successfully completed 87 combat sorties, registering an attrition rate of 3.2% per mission, a figure that, while still inherently perilous, represented a stark improvement over the unendurable percentages witnessed in the preceding year. Captain Robert Rosenthal, their astute operations officer, largely ascribed this significant enhancement to the strategic employment of altitude maneuvers, synergistically coupled with superior fighter protection. Furthermore, surviving air crews from this distinguished group invariably cited the climb technique as a pivotal factor that afforded them a tangible opportunity for survival against the lethal precision of predictor-guided anti-aircraft barrages. This innovative methodology extended its influence beyond merely impacting immediate survival statistics. It fundamentally altered the perception of vulnerability among bomber crews. In the grim reality of 1943, anti-aircraft fire was often perceived as an indifferent, unavoidable natural phenomenon akin to inclement weather, which one simply had to suffer through. By the middle of 1944, however, aircrews had gained a profound understanding that they possessed the agency to actively counteract this threat through skillful and precise flight execution. This profound psychological transformation held immense significance for overall morale. Pilots, in particular, transitioned from feeling like passive, defenseless targets to experiencing themselves as engaged participants in a dynamic tactical engagement. Consequently, training curricula began to underscore this newly discovered sense of empowerment. Novice aircrews were indoctrinated with the understanding that their role transcended merely piloting heavy aircraft. They were, in fact, operating within an intricate electronic and mechanical combat arena, where their judicious operational choices held the potential to neutralize adversary systems. The enduring impact of the climbing into the flak strategy resonated far beyond the conclusion of World War II. Officers dedicated to tactical development within the Air Force meticulously scrutinized the technique's proven effectiveness as they formulated operational doctrine for subsequent bomber engagements. The core tenet that injecting an element of unpredictability into aerial flight characteristics could effectively circumvent prediction-driven fire control mechanisms subsequently became a cornerstone of all evasive aerial tactics. In the theater of the Korean War, B-29 flight crews, confronting Soviet-engineered, radar-guided anti-aircraft fire, judiciously applied modified iterations of the altitude alteration methodology. The underlying physical principles remained constant, notwithstanding the technological progression of predictor systems from rudimentary mechanical calculators to nascent electronic apparatuses. Even the advent of the jet propulsion era did not diminish the pertinence of this crucial lesson. During the protracted Cold War, Strategic Air Command's B-52 crews underwent rigorous training in terrain-following penetration profiles, deliberately oscillating their altitude without cessation to confound Soviet surface-to-air missile targeting computations. While these missiles represented a significant leap, being considerably swifter than the 88mm shells of previous conflicts and employing electronic rather than mechanical guidance, the fundamental axiom endured. Unvarying altitude presented a predictable target, and predictability in this context was inherently lethal. Contemporary terrain-following radar systems and sophisticated automated flight control architectures effectively implement the identical fundamental concept that B-17 pilots had empirically ascertained over the skies of Germany to maintain an unpredictable flight profile within the operational parameters dictated by mission objectives. Even amidst the advanced epoch of stealth technology and precision standoff weaponry, the tactical essence of climbing into the flak demonstrably persists. Modern aerial strike planning places considerable emphasis on diversifying ingress routes, assiduously avoiding any foreseeable flight trajectories, and incorporating swift, evasive jinking maneuvers during the critical terminal attack sequences. While the precise technical modalities have naturally evolved in tandem with technological advancements, the foundational logical premise enduring without alteration, adversarial fire control mechanisms, whether they manifest as antiquated mechanical predictors or cutting-edge phased array radars, necessitate consistent and predictable target conduct to attain peak accuracy. To withhold this predictability from them is to invariably diminish their operational efficacy. The compelling narrative of B-17 pilots deliberately ascending into the maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire transcends the mere account of a singular tactical breakthrough. More profoundly, it serves as a potent illustration of how military establishments undergo transformation when established doctrine collides with harsh operational realities, and the latter inevitably prevails. The Army Air Forces had, with considerable foresight and investment, poured vast resources into meticulously crafting a comprehensive doctrine for precision daylight bombing operations. This meticulously developed doctrine had undergone rigorous testing, continuous refinement, and subsequent formal codification within official training manuals, thereby representing the sanctioned and approved methodology for conducting aerial campaigns. Nevertheless, when this officially sanctioned approach resulted in air crews suffering casualties at utterly unsustainable proportions, the organizational structure demonstrated sufficient adaptability to undergo a crucial evolution. The impetus for this innovation originated from the operational ranks, emerging organically from pilots and their crews who placed greater credence in their first-hand field observations than in the precepts of their printed training manuals. This critical adaptation proved successful because leadership across various hierarchical echelons acknowledged the veracity of these grassroots innovations and actively facilitated their widespread dissemination. Figures such as General LeMay and other prominent commanders possessed the authority to demand unwavering adherence to established doctrine, potentially even initiating court-martial proceedings against pilots who diverged from approved operational protocols. Instead, they judiciously reviewed the empirical evidence, recognized the demonstrable effectiveness of the new methods, and subsequently formalized those practices that were proving successful. This intrinsic organizational flexibility, specifically the readiness to glean vital insights from the personnel actively engaged in combat, may well have been as consequential as the tactical innovation itself. The core of the discussion revolves around a particular tactical approach. During the intense aerial engagements of World War II, when the stakes were immeasurably high and the threat of enemy anti-aircraft fire loomed large, air crews found themselves facing seemingly insurmountable odds. It was in these crucible moments that these brave individuals, under immense pressure, instinctively developed and refined an unconventional method to preserve their lives. Crucially, the higher echelons of the command structure demonstrated remarkable foresight and flexibility, allowing these grassroots innovations to flourish rather than suppressing them with rigid adherence to established protocols. This willingness to trust the experience of those on the front lines proved to be a pivotal factor in saving countless lives. The specific innovation that emerged from these harrowing circumstances involved a counterintuitive maneuver rather than maintaining a predictable, steady course within the calculated kill zone of enemy anti-aircraft predictors. The airmen began to climb directly towards the very explosions of the Flak. While mathematical models and pre-existing operational doctrine unequivocally declared such a move to be impossible and fundamentally incorrect, the stark reality of combat painted a different picture. Thousands of airmen, defying the theoretical impossibilities, returned safely from their missions during World War II precisely because this audacious and seemingly illogical tactic proved effective in disrupting the enemy's targeting solutions. It was a testament to human ingenuity under duress. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of the video to grasp the full scope of this fascinating topic. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription, and please feel free to share a comment about where you are from and what you think about this compelling video topic. The enduring lesson or legacy gleaned from this extraordinary period of military aviation is profound and far-reaching. Established manuals and approved procedures, while typically foundational, are not infallible. In critical situations, particularly those involving life or death outcomes, the imperative for survival often demands a departure from conventional wisdom and the embrace of radical innovation, irrespective of what the official guidelines or long-held beliefs might dictate. The testimony of those who survived stands as irrefutable proof that sometimes the most effective path forward is found by challenging the very rules that were designed to ensure safety.